So this afternoon, to end our day today, we have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Rohan Jowallah, who will present on the topic of organizational inclusivity, creating an inclusive school environment. So a little bit about Dr. Jowallah. He is the senior instructional designer, adjunct faculty at the University of Central Florida. Born in Jamaica, migrated to the United Kingdom in 2001, but currently resides in the United States. Living in these countries, he says, has given him a global perspective on the term inclusion. He has been a part of the University of Central Florida Faculty Inclusivity Committee, designing and teaching courses on inclusion and diversity for several universities. He also has coordinated support for university students who have needed special accommodations in the UK. He has presented papers on inclusion at the national and international levels. Currently, Dr. Jowallah has over 50 conference presentations where he draws from his life experiences and the experiences of others to stimulate thoughtful and engaging conversations designed to enhance inclusivity. So please join me in welcoming for our afternoon presentation, Dr. Rohan Jowallah. Take it away.
Thank you, moderator. Let me just expand and do a check if everyone is seeing my screen at this point in time.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. My audio is clear?
Yes, very.
All right. Thank you, moderator, for that wonderful introduction. And I want to say welcome to everyone who is presently in this session and will be joining us. It is my pleasure to speak with you today, and I hope this session will actually bring across some important points that I've thought about over the past decade or so. My theme for today, as stated earlier, is organizational inclusivity. And how do we create and sustain organizational inclusivity within our present context? My context is really interesting. I was born in Kingston, and as a matter of fact, over a period of time, my aunt, who was a church minister under her husband, decided it would be best for me to come live with them in Clarendon. So I do have Clarendon connection. And then afterwards, I moved with them to Montego Bay. My mom was still around supporting us. However, I am blessed to have had two mothers and one father. And I attended the Bethlehem Moravian Teachers College, and after which, in 2001, after leaving and teaching for some while, I migrated to England, and I taught at several places. And during that time, I discovered there was an issue that I wanted to explore, and the issue was inclusion. Because I think my life journey provides a pathway for others to understand inclusion. And I didn't understand the first time when I realized there was a need for inclusion when I was going to high school, because, you know, my hair was curly and the others were not. Other students in my class were not. So they decided to call me, you know, the normal, what they called me back then, you know, the C word. And, you know, I always say, you know, it's hard worker, because apparently my parents, my great grandfather, he was an indentured servant, arrived in Jamaica in 1917, lived and for a long time, worked at the Rose Hall plantation for 54 years. So, you know, at that time, I'm writing a story now and I realize that we really need to consider inclusion within the context. So today, I want to examine the concept of inclusion within the construct of organizations. I want to explore some of the challenges that can take place when considering building an inclusive school culture. And I want to highlight elements of an inclusive school culture. And what I'm going to focus on is really teachers, leaders within the context of their school organization. I'm not touching students because that's not my area. I'm not going to that end today. I'm focusing on staff. And I want us to consider strategies for the development and the sustainment of an inclusive culture. You know, it's so important that we realize we have things to consider. So before I start off, I have these critical questions that I want to ask. The first is, have you ever been excluded from an event or denied access to service or to a service? Have you ever knowingly used your social connections to advance your career? Have you ever used language to discriminate against others in your society, school, community? Have you ever promoted an individual, if you're in management, based on your personal friendship rather than their talent and ability? And do you believe that total inclusion is possible? I'm going to ask our support moderator helping out to give these poll questions so we can have a feedback on what the people are thinking in the session. So I'll give you a minute. I was told to give you a minute or so.
Yes.
So starting now.
Launching them now.
Another 10 seconds should do the trick.
Yeah, about 10
Responses
seconds.
are rolling in, Dr. Jowallah. We're up to 113, 16, 21,
All right,
124.
thank you.
Yeah, they're rocking in.
They're
I
rocking.
think folks
Sounds
had to
good.
find,
Sounds good.
where to respond. So
All right, all right,
yeah,
all right.
yeah.
Yeah, we'll give you time.
Yeah, give it a little bit more because
Just a little more, because folks
yeah.
are really responding. When we see it start to slow down, then we can call.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, we are at 42%, and it has started to slow down a little, as I think you have gotten
that's it.
most of it right now. Yeah.
Yeah, yes, good. So I'm not seeing the results. So if
Okay. I think we have to stop polling.
yes.
Yeah, I'll end it.
Mhm.
We'll end it on 2 minutes.
Okay.
3
All
seconds.
right.
Yes. Okay, we're gonna end it. It's 47, 48, 47. Okay. Share results.
All right. So have you ever been excluded from an event? We have 64% individuals saying yes, 36 saying no. Interesting results. Have you ever knowingly used your social connections to advance your career? 24 said yes. 76 are living good, so they have never done that. And have you ever used language in a discriminatory way against anyone in your school, community, or society? 31. And 69 said no. And have you ever promoted? And that's the one. Someone said 9% said yes, they have promoted their friends or someone over talent. And do you believe that total inclusion is possible? And 84% said yes, and 16% said no. And at the end of the session, I really want us to consider the last one. The above are important, but I think if we consider the last one as we move forward through this, we will understand the concept of inclusivity and inclusion. So I'm going to stop. Thanks for sharing that. These are very important information that we can start off, because I can see now that we have a mix in the set of individuals and responses here, and that's good. Now, I like to look at what Martin Luther King said. In reflecting on the quote, we can establish that our society is somewhat divisive, as I always say, and that is because we're so individualistic with our concerns, and rather than considering humanity. And that's one of the first things that we have to understand. The individual part of me becomes so overwhelmed that I sometimes do not consider others, hence the issue of being excluded. I want us to take you on a little journey, because I think it's important that every nation should foster an inclusive culture. Why do I start with immigration? Because I think it's so important. Because in the poll, you'll realize I asked about language. And language can be used in such a way that you are discriminatory in your approach, but you don't understand what you have done. And it brings me back to the point of me coming to Jamaica in 2008, and I was attending a Crossroads conference at UWI, and I was so happy to be there. I was really happy. And you know, when the plane lands and you know everyone is trying to get off the plane as quickly as possible, and I don't know how Jamaicans do it, but the plane just touches down, and before it reaches the gate, everyone has loosed their seat belts and are ready to move off. I was sitting there because I was waiting patiently to just taking the ambience of everything. So I moved forward, got my stuff eventually. I was one of the last ones to leave the plane. I was feeling happy. I'm coming back to Jamaica to present, and I walk up to the immigration officer, who takes my passport, my Jamaican passport. He looks at my passport, looks at my image, and he says to me at that point in time, "What kind of Al-Qaeda name is this?" Al-Qaeda. He's associating me with a terrorist. He has already stereotyped me because my name is different. That language, in its fact, is discriminatory. I was shocked. So I asked him, "Why would you say that? It's not a joke." But my issue is the immigration officer had no idea what his behavior had resulted in. So what I'm saying is, sometimes you're not aware that you're excluding someone or using language in a derogatory form, but you are doing it. You know, so what I'm saying is, the issue of inclusion is not associated with United States. It's not associated with just England. Everyone in a society will require some level of inclusion at some point. And I want to go through this presentation to highlight that need. Now, let us look at organizational inclusivity. And when I talk about organizational inclusivity, I'm really talking about creating equal opportunities within your schools and organizations, regardless of differences. It requires equality for all. It requires valuing people, treating others the same way you want to be treated, respecting them too, respecting their viewpoints, and taking purposeful action to include others. So if you see a colleague not being included in a discussion and you realize the person is a bit standoffish, as we say in Jamaica, try to include them. But I want to also touch on the point that inclusion requires personal sacrifices for the exemption of personal gains. Why do I say that? And you know, I say this because I wrote a book recently on organizational inclusivity, and one of my greatest reflection points took place in Jamaica. I had someone who was working on a grill for me, and he was at home working, and I came up with some patties and I asked him, "Do you want a patty?" And he said, and by the way, it was juicy beef patty, those luscious, creamy patties, right? And he said, "No, I don't want a patty at this point in time." I said, "What, you don't eat the Jamaican patties?" He said, "Yes, but there are 2 other workers working with me, and if I take and go around there, it doesn't look good." Luckily, I had 3 patties, I gave them 3. But this man it was not an odd moment, because a couple months after I was passing his place, I stopped and I said, "You know what, do you want a drink?" He said, "Sure, I want a drink, but I can't have a drink and my other friends are not drinking." And I'm saying, whoa, he caught you again. So what I'm saying, within the context, he was purposely making a sacrifice because he did not want to exclude his friends who would not be drinking. And by the way, I was having orange juice at that point in time because I'm not a drinker. So I want us to reflect. Is our school system in Jamaica as inclusive in that point that we will allow individuals, you will make a personal sacrifice for an individual? Because I think we have to reflect on that. My critical question is also, are you willing to make a personal sacrifice for someone, knowing that the person will get that promotion, or knowing the event might not lead for you to get any personal gains? And another thought that I have is, are you willing to advocate for a colleague who's being marginalized? Because I think that's some part of the system too. I want to say that, and this is a point that I want to touch on because a lot of individuals highlighted the point that total inclusion is possible. Sad to say, I preach inclusion, I try to walk inclusion, I am trying to live that life of being inclusive, but I know the ultimate will never be achieved. So do I stop trying? The answer is no. I try to work towards that because Sally Tomlinson, England, 2010 told me in a presentation, you cannot have an inclusive system within a capitalist system that is governed by profit and greed. You know, so therefore, if you work in an organization that has pensions associated with your salary range, it's going to reproduce a level of inequality. So when we talk about inclusion in the context of here and globally, inclusion is a work in practice. It is not a final, because if I say you have met 100% inclusivity practice, I would say that you have fully understood your biases, your judgments, your schema, you understand your ideological positions and so forth. And that's why we have to consistently engage in the process of inclusivity to move forward. So I want to put that point out. You can all tend to disagree with me, but think about it. You can't measure love, you can't measure inclusion, and many individuals now are trying to do this measurement. So we need to move away from that. So as you look at your schools and your organizations, you're trying to develop an inclusive system. However, it requires consistent practice. All right. Now, I want us to look at the challenges of developing an inclusive school culture. And one of the things that I've found out is that the lack of transparency has a lot to do with it. The lack of transparency can erode the trust and reduce motivation for all stakeholders who are in the system. An inclusive culture requires transparency, not the hide and seek approach. You go around the corner, you do something and you promote this one and you reward that one. It needs to be transparent, because when you're transparent, the organization develops the level of fairness. Because I think many times in our institutions and schools, we tend to say, that is not fair, that appointment was not fair, he got this, she got that. But if you're transparent and people understand that you have milestones that you have to achieve before you reach that part, it's greater. So you have to have documentation that will allow you to measure to establish the transparency required. Another thing that I always see as one of the big points too is scarce resources. Organizational conflicts will arise when you have limited resources. Who gets that classroom on the ground floor? Who gets to be near that point? So therefore we're looking at limited resources. And as one person said, wherever there are scarce resources, we'll have conflict. My journey to Jamaica has taught me a lot, from Jamaica to England, that is. And the first time I stepped into a classroom in England, I wondered, why did I get all these students? It is apparent that all the teachers decided, I don't want X or Y to be in my class. Give the new teachers coming from Jamaica, they can handle them. They knew they couldn't handle them really, but they just wanted to get rid of them. So therefore, their preference led to additional conflict for the Jamaican teachers arriving. And in many schools, we have individuals that will select certain things to make their job easier, and that creates conflict too within that context. Now, communication and transparency, they seem to go hand in hand. But for me, let me say an inclusive language must, an organization must use inclusive language, right? Okay. So instead of saying I, we say we, because we're together. Instead of using language that is oppressive and demanding, we use language that is engaging and respectful to the receivers. You know, I can say to someone, move that desk. However, if I say it in love, please kindly move that desk. I want you to help me. It's different. So we need to understand the way we use language. It should not be oppressive. We should not use language to marginalize people. And sometimes in our organizations, we do that. And I want to touch on the issue of communication because it's so important. The other day at a certain university, there was an incident where someone used their mobile phone to text someone else regarding someone. And that person was high, very high in the organization. And something went wrong and a screenshot was sent to Twitter regarding that. That person was put under investigation. So when you're communicating, remember communication issues can lead to problems. So be careful how you communicate, because when someone finds out that you have been, in Jamaica terms, I don't know if I have it right still, so about them, you can have problems. So avoid the so business, because so behavior can create distrust and conflict in the organization. If I need to update my vocabulary regarding the so, please let me know, because I need to learn, all right? But I still have my connections in Jamaica, still try to keep up, right? But the language changes so quickly, so forgive me. Another point is competition. I love competition. I played a lot of games back in Jamaica, football and that sort of stuff and everything. But when it comes on to competition in an organizational structure, you have to be very careful, because if teachers and middle managers start competing, you might have an environment that is counterproductive towards inclusivity. For example, I'll give an example. For example, a group of teachers work on a project, right? So one teacher decides, you know what? I want to go for promotion and I want to do that. I want to do so many things. So you know what? The teacher says or suggests that the project is their own, excluding others from it. You know, so this creates this sort of competition where I've seen it destroy organizations, because people have to cover their work, hide their work under the desk, don't go out for lunch with a colleague because you don't want your ideas to be stolen and so forth. It is dangerous, the competition that exists. Competition has its place, don't get me wrong, but an inclusive culture is rather collaborative rather than competitive. And I love the word collaboration, because it means we're sharing the wealth of knowledge together and we're sharing the achievements together. So I think those are relevant to what I'm saying at this point in time. And there's the aspect of personal judgment. How many times do we judge an individuals around us? And that's one of the basic things that it's sometimes, as I've read, we make decisions about people in milliseconds based on our schemas that we have. So these can lead to the exclusion of others. Therefore, it's necessary to reflect on your biases and to change your behavior in order to be inclusive, so that the inclusive ideology is driven by day-to-day consideration regarding your action. People have called me out because I have not demonstrated some principles, and the best people to call me out are my children. Last night, one made an assumption at me. I said, you know, I said that purposely, but that she didn't forgive me because I was out of place with regards my thoughts on inclusion. And then we have what is called lack of emotional intelligence. It's like the inability to read the room. You are unaware of others around you and their emotions. And this will create problems and lead many educators to be unable to support colleagues during the time of distress. And I want to pause and just allow you to think as I give you this example. I worked in an organization a couple years ago where someone was terminally ill. And I called an individual for an item, and that was I requested because I needed that item. And when I called the individual said the person who was terminally ill had responsibility for that. And she was dropping the ball, and I could not believe it. The person is terminally ill and she's dropping the ball. The lack of connection and humility. And I must say the person passed on a few months after. So we have to be, and these cannot be taught, because I'm thinking, and I'll bring another one up because I think it's connected to the other one I might talk about, is humanity. Demonstration of preferential treatment. And this is where you can have the total erosion of an inclusive organization. In my experience, this key element of special treatment or preferential treatment towards one staff member or a selective department can destroy an organization, because teachers and others will feel as if their work is not of the same standard. And I talk about, as I've written about, I talk about organizational competence for inclusion. If you are doing preferential treatment, stop, because I think it goes counter to inclusion. I think you have the ability to assess your staff, to know the competencies of your staff, and to award them with tasks to do based on their competencies. So the preferential treatment should not be given to just one person, but you should, if you're about equal opportunity in your school, you should give the best and the most talented person that job or that role. And of course, I mentioned earlier the lack of humility. When someone is terminally ill and someone can mention, you know, she's dropping the ball. And I saw that again a couple of months ago. A colleague had lost a relative and someone was saying, I don't know why she's not doing X or Y. But the issue for me is, when you're going through the mourning process, you need to have the support from your staff. And if you can go through that support system where you know your staff and others are in that school organization are supporting you, what greater love can you have? And there's a survey that is done in United States. They ask the question, is a Pew report to check on the welfare of your staff. Do you have a best friend at work? And I know for me personally, I am in a predominantly white organization. I'm a Jamaican. I do not have a best friend at work. It might, but I would have had a best friend at work in Jamaica, right? So I'm not far from that. So I just put that point out there. And of course, don't shoot the messenger at this point, but I had to bring this on up because it's about politics. The dreaded political external inferences that can come into the school. Many times our schools are politically connected, and this plays a part in the culture and limits the aspect of inclusion towards individuals in that school. While we can't rid ourselves of the political interference based on the context, we have to find a way that these political interference regarding the assignments of whatever leadership we have or so forth, or boards, sign on to a memorandum of understanding regarding inclusion. So when you look at for example, I'm going to call this one out. Don't shoot the messenger at this point in time. When you look at the school board should have a variety of individuals, male and females, not predominantly one gender. You know, so I think it's time that we have equity in that area too. So just to put that out. I'm going to move on because as I said, I'll trod lightly on this. I might have some discussions coming around, but I think it's necessary for me to highlight an issue that I think is worth mentioning. Now, I want to take a moment, because I think it's important to take a moment to really reflect on addressing the diverse needs of employees. To deny people their human rights is to challenge their very humanity, Nelson Mandela. And why do I say this? The employment of people with disability should be a part of your organizations too. You should not say, all right, because the person is disabled or limited in any aspect, we are not employing them. Another thing that I'm concerned about is that we see the physical disability, but at times we do not see other disabilities teachers or others may have. You know, And there are some teachers that have struggled over a period of time to acquire, they've had to work very hard to accomplish their achievements because they might have had an issue that they struggle with. For example, learning and studying was more difficult for them. And now recently we have people diagnosed as ADHD and so forth, but in our time, in my time, we did not have that support. So what I'm saying is we see disability in the physical, that we can actually see someone is in a wheelchair bound, but sometimes we do not see other disabilities around. So we have to be very careful. Another issue that we need to understand, and I'm just touching on this, how do we address individuals in a school that eventually might find out that they have mental illnesses? Because it can happen. You know, it can pop up, it can happen. And I think the support system should be there to empower teachers to understand that they will get the needed support. So don't, you know, many times we think that teachers are isolated and administrators are isolated from these things. No, some of them are going through their life-changing events. And for example, when I talk about supporting and addressing the diverse needs of employees, I'm thinking about, for example, a teacher who needs dialysis at least twice per week. How would the school support them? So I want us to think deeper regarding inclusion, because I think the school should be a place where they should be accommodating to individuals, supporting them. And for example, another example I could pull out is a teacher returning to work after an accident. How would the school support this teacher? And one of the things, you could think about, if the teacher's working on the second floor, you could remove that class to the first floor and have the teacher teaching that class and support the teacher with the necessary accommodations. Being proactive regarding these life-changing events will be important, especially in sickness and in death. So when we think about inclusion, I'm just thinking in a wide concept of supporting individuals in that organization to achieve their full potential. And that's what you want from an inclusive culture. And the thought about inclusive governance comes to mind, because I think if we look, and this is what the United Nations and others have been pumping out regarding inclusive governance, because when you think about a strategy for developing an inclusive school, you have to think how the principal will govern and other line managers will govern. And I think we have to understand that inclusive governance requires consultation with employees and all stakeholders. It's not just the principal or the leaders making that decision. But if teachers share in that vision and all members in that organization, that school, share in that vision, then you have greater trust, a climate that is filled with motivation. So therefore, employees who practice inclusive governance will reap the benefits of broad participation of workers. And it shows that you value your workers too. And you also are working proactively to reduce the barriers to inclusivity. So think about this. Inclusivity is not just acting on what you see, but making plans to address things that will take place. You know, and I think that's so important within our context. I didn't reach this point before. Let me just share a little analogy. I had to go through a lot of change, personal change and mindset, having done a master's in special needs and inclusion and diversity and equality back in UK. I had to change my perspective on many things. Did not change my value. I changed my perspective. I had to be accommodating to other people's perspective. I'm not going to change my religion for inclusion's sake. No, I will not. But I have to understand and value people's decisions and try to avoid judgments. And one of my biggest part was the culture that I was brought up in Jamaica. And I'm not going to get there, but I had to be ready to be accepting of people's position to move on, you know, because we know how it is. I'm not going to touch further on that one. So what are the benefits of an inclusive school culture? I mentioned earlier, it gives you, it motivates staff. It enhances productivity between staff and of course students. Teachers who are comfortable will not leave the school. So therefore, you tend to hear that that school is a good school. So you know what? Your improvement in your recruitment and of course your retention will take place. There's greater community partnerships because teachers are a network of people working in that organization. And of course, because of that network, you have greater community partnerships. And if you look at what's an inclusive school design and curriculum, you'll see how the benefits of having an inclusive organizations rather, will run counter with external partnerships. So if we look at it also, an inclusive school would provide enhanced opportunities for teachers within the school for professional development, enrich diversity within the school, and of course, greater collaboration among teachers and leaders. So one person is not thinking, you know what, I'm going to run off with that idea, because it's a shared collaborative process of working together. And I think that is so important when you look at it. So as we move forward, how do we get there? Because I think that's important. Before you can even conceptualize of the building of inclusive school, and I know people are working on it, a lot of things they might say, if there's school inclusive on your check mark, but you need a policy formation. You need to understand or to draft what the school is going to identify as their inclusive plan or their inclusive policy, you know, for teachers or for the organization. We also have to look at how the government is putting forward their policy on inclusion, because I think it's important that governments in Jamaica and across the Caribbean think about inclusivity within the context of what I'm saying here. Of course, as you formulate and you get the policy, you have to have a designated committee that is going to be working on it. And of course, you have to bring in staff development experts who will knowingly guide the process regarding inclusion, because it's going to get a little bit rocky sometimes. You can't manage all the aspects of inclusion. So I would say set targets. And as you set targets, you say, all right, you know what? I'm setting these targets and I'm going to evaluate them over a period of time. I think within any school in Jamaica, you can have an inclusive champion, someone who designates, who shows the principles of what an inclusivity expert or person should be in that school. So I think we can have inclusive champions based on the policy framework that we have created and what are we using and the evaluation tool we're going to be using. So I think it has to come from a policy. It cannot be say, yes, we're inclusive. You have to know what you're looking for. Part of staff satisfaction, the respect, communication, all the elements that I've mentioned earlier. You have to know what you're looking for. So as we move forward, within this context too, it feeds into the school culture, because first, teachers are more aware of the students' needs, because their communicating is not a one-day workshop. It does not reside on a piece of paper. It resides in my personal actions. And if my personal actions are questionable, hence I need to go back to that drawing board to reflect and to change my behavior, because my words and my deeds will cause people to be excluded. And I do not want that. So guess what? I'm preaching the message of inclusion is a work in practice. I'm going to pause now for your questions, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see you and you can ask the questions at this point. Thanks for listening, and I do wait for your questions.
Okay, so I have to tell you, Dr. Jowallah, the feedback in the chat has been phenomenal in terms of folks agreeing with you and indicating this was excellent, timely, on point. I think we're really feeling your presentation, Dr. Jowallah, is the bottom line. So I'll let Dr. Dice handle any Q&A. I haven't seen any questions as yet, but maybe he has another spot as well.
Yeah, it's a lot of wonderful comments. It's not a lot of questions at all. It's some people asking if how will that work in their particular school? But it's different from school to school. What do you say if you have to personalize the inclusivity?
I think general inclusivity resides on the premise that you'll treat everyone fairly and you'll try to ensure that everyone has equal opportunity. So I think if you follow the fundamental principle of inclusion, getting everyone and treating everyone fairly, I think that's the premise on where you start at. How you conceptualize your policy will all depend on what are your focus and what you need to focus on. So I think that those are important principles to think about. So I think within an organizational culture or context, you really have to think about what do you want to focus on and work towards that. But it should not be different because it's going to be about equality for all.
Okay. Dr.
Jowallah, is presentation going to be available to us to post?
Yes, it will definitely be available.
Yes, I think that was a question.
Yeah, it was.
So, okay.
How do we as teachers influence that that mode of inclusivity to our leaders, like principals? If a teacher attends this and they want to say, let's provide inclusivity in our school, what's the approach they should take?
I see a lot of times where when you talk about inclusivity, especially, I'm going to contextualize it to the Caribbean, in United States, we have to be very careful because the vision of inclusivity by leaders might not be the vision that the teachers want, So therefore, we have to have a joint effort from administrators and people who are working the school to come together for policy making purposes or to design any initiative. So I think one of the things that leaders need to understand is that their perspective on inclusion might differ. They might think that you're doing a wonderful job, but in reality, when evaluation is done by staff, they might see it differently. So therefore, that's why it goes back to the issue of inclusive governance, where inclusive governance talks about getting the voices of people to be involved in the decision-making process. So I think I go back to that. So another point I want to mention, an inclusive leader is a reflexive and reflective leader at the same time, because the leader is saying, what can I do to reduce the inequality, and takes purposeful action. If the principle is not there yet, it's going to be difficult, and that's the reality.
Understood. Okay.
Very, very good.
If
It's
there
a
are
whole lot of good, very good. We don't have a lot of questions at all. The comments are very wonderful. Very. Okay.
We try and capture them for you, Dr. Jowallah, because I think folks are walking away with this with just the right injection that they needed at this point in the day. Because I think that you have left them with some things to think about, but also some things to do. I have to say that one point that I want to reiterate was something that you said about, you started off by talking about the benefits to the school by having an inclusion policy and implementing inclusion all around. And the thought that came to my mind was children learn what they see. When inclusion is a part of their life, of their school lives, they see and learn because it works. And so what better way to teach our children than by modeling the behavior, right? That we want them to exude, right? So it just creates a win-win all the way around. Phenomenal. I wrote down all kinds of words and that I was going to use to try to summarize this, but I don't think I need to. I think everyone that is a part of our session today gets it. I think they get it. It's not to say that it's easy.
It's not easy. It's not easy. And I'm telling you, I have had to reach the point where I become a reflective person.
Yeah.
And, I see, and I'll just share this with the group, I see a lot of people in the United States talking about inclusion, but they're not willing to give out the privilege that they have, and that's one, and they're not willing to engage. We have a lot of issues here as it relates to many things, and I think we have to have a behavioral change before you can be inclusive. And I think that's a key.
Absolutely. Yes.
Listen, if you may, I want to insert something here because
Sure.
we have an announcement. We have a new brand. The talk show is called EduTalk Diaspora Engagement. And one of our guests on there this Wednesday evening at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time is Dr. Jowallah. We have a panel of guests. It's about 5 people, all of us. I host it and co-host with Leo Gillen. It's on Jamaicans.com and on JDTAN Facebook page. We have it every other Wednesday. We have thought-provoking discussions right across the educational arena, and we invited quite a few people. So this week we'll be talking about race and education. So we're gonna strengthen this conversation even more then.
And I think I have a request for my email, so
yeah, drop it in the
individuals can,
chat.
yeah,
And
I've dropped it in the chat. Yeah.
yeah, just so everybody knows that the contact information for presenters will be on our website, jdtan.org, at the end of our virtual education summit, just so you know. Also coming up tonight is our virtual story time. Every Tuesday evening, virtual story time is on at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time or 7:30 Jamaica time every Tuesday evening on JDTAN Facebook page. And it's live. That one is live. It's not like this. It's open to everybody on earth. So you can tune into that one on Facebook as well. So we have quite a few things going on from our education task force throughout the diaspora. All right, Leslie, over to you. Thank
Okay,
you.
with that, we thank you very much, Dr. Jowallah, once again, for sharing your time and expertise with us. This was certainly a wonderful discussion, and we thank you very much for providing the icing on the cake for this, our first day of our virtual education summit. So thank you all very much once again.